Somewhere in the exact wording of a ransom note lies a detail that almost never makes it into the headlines. The word choice, the missing time zone, the strange insistence on a term nobody who actually commits a real kidnapping tends to use out loud. 6.5 months into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, a forensic psychologist who spent his career inside actual hostage negotiations looked at the 2 notes investigators released to the public and reached a conclusion that cuts against almost everything the case has been publicly treated as since the very beginning. He doesn't think this was a kidnapping at all. He thinks it started as something else entirely and went wrong in a way that's genuinely difficult to sit with once you understand what he actually believes happened to her afterward. This is Forensic Disconnect. We've covered Nancy Guthrie's case on this channel before, walking through the 6-month mark, the federal jurisdiction dispute, and the wrongful detention of a delivery driver named Carlos Palazuelos. Today we're going deeper into one specific, under-examined thread. What an actual forensic psychologist thinks the ransom notes themselves reveal about who wrote them and why, a genuinely detailed piece of professional analysis that's gotten far less attention than the notes' contents themselves, and a separate, murkier question about whether the public has actually seen everything investigators have gathered so far in this now 6.5-month-old case. Quick anchor for anyone catching this case for the first time. Nancy Guthrie is the 84-year-old mother of Today show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was last seen at her home in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson, Arizona, on the night of January 31st, dropped off by her son-in-law at 9:48 that evening, her garage door closing behind her 2 minutes later. Around 1:47 the following morning, a doorbell camera at her home was disconnected by a masked, gloved individual, footage the FBI would later credit with providing one of the case's only clear leads. She was reported missing around noon on February 1st, after failing to appear for an online church service a friend had expected her to join that morning. Investigators found her phone, her shoes, and her medication still inside the house untouched. 6.5 months later, she has not been found, and no suspect has been named. She's the widow of a longtime Washington attorney, and by every account from people who know her, an independent, mentally sharp woman who lived alone by choice, not out of necessity, a detail worth holding on to because it rules out, almost immediately, any explanation involving her simply wandering off on her own. The kind of scenario that sometimes explains disappearances involving elderly individuals, but that simply doesn't fit what's documented here. Let's start with the notes themselves. First, because they've become the single most scrutinized piece of evidence in this entire case, and for good reason. On July 31st, more than 5 months after Nancy disappeared, the Pima County Sheriff's Department released the full text of 2 ransom letters. The first note, sent February 2nd to local Tucson television station Called, stated that Nancy was safe but scared, demanded $4 million in Bitcoin to a partially redacted wallet address, with the price rising to $6 million if the family missed a deadline and threatened to kill her if payment wasn't made. It also referenced specific details: a smartwatch near her bed, a damaged floodlight in the backyard, details investigators initially treated as a possible sign the writer had genuine inside knowledge of the home, though it's worth flagging that both details had already circulated in earlier drone footage and press coverage of the property, meaning they don't necessarily prove the writer had access that no ordinary follower of the case's early coverage could have obtained independently. A second note, sent February 6th, claimed Nancy had already died, stating, "She perished shortly after she was taken. We believe it was heart-related. She is buried in nature now," and closing with an apology, "We are truly sorry." That second note, more than the first, is the one that's generated the most sustained professional skepticism, precisely because of how it handles the subject of her death. Investigators explicitly said they don't know whether the notes are authentic, and released them specifically hoping the public might recognize the writer's patterns of word choice, syntax, and phraseology. That's an important detail on its own. This wasn't a confident release of confirmed evidence. It was, by the department's own framing, a request for help identifying whether these documents mean anything at all. It's worth pausing on why a 6-month delay between the note's original arrival and their public release happened at all, since that gap is itself part of the story. Investigators generally have strong reasons to withhold exactly this kind of communication early in a case, Releasing it too soon risks tipping off the actual perpetrator about what law enforcement has and hasn't seen, invites a flood of copycat or attention-seeking messages that dilute genuine leads, and can compromise the department's ability to later authenticate any real future contact against a document the public has already picked apart. Waiting until the case had gone 6 months without a break, and specifically choosing that symbolic anniversary to release the notes, suggests a deliberate decision to trade some of that original protective secrecy for a fresh jolt of public attention, precisely the kind of trade-off Dr. Mohandie later described as a recognized, if imperfect, investigative tool. Independent journalist Brian Enton, who's covered this case extensively across dozens of episodes since Nancy first went missing, brought that uncertainty into sharper focus by pointing out something genuinely strange about the timeline of what got reported before the notes were officially released. Around late June, more than a month before the sheriff's department made the notes public, Enton reported, based on a source he described as reliable, that the second note contained no apology. Separately, and around the same time, NBC News reported the same thing, citing 3 people familiar with the investigation, publishing a headline stating the second note did not include an apology for allegedly taking Guthrie, but it expressed regret over her passing. When the sheriff's office finally released the actual text of that note in late July, it ended with an explicit apology. "We are truly sorry. That's a real documented discrepancy, and we think it deserves to be treated carefully, rather than either dismissed or blown up into more than the evidence actually supports." There are a few different ways this gap could be explained. It's possible the sources Enton and NBC relied on were simply working from an earlier draft, an incomplete transcription, or their own imperfect second-hand account of a document they hadn't actually seen in full, the kind of small distortion that happens constantly in complex investigations relayed through multiple people before reaching a reporter. It's possible no apology for taking her, and an apology at the very end for how things turned out are being read as contradictory when they're actually describing 2 different things. The note doesn't apologize for the abduction itself anywhere in its text, but it does close with a general expression of regret over her death. A distinction subtle enough that 3 separate sources could plausibly have described it as no apology, while a full read of the actual document would technically include one. And it's possible, as Enton himself raised without claiming certainty, that there's a version of this note or another note entirely that investigators have not yet made public, consistent with the well-documented reality that law enforcement routinely withholds certain evidence during an active investigation. It's worth being precise about what kind of claim each of these explanations actually is, because they carry very different weight. The first 2, an imperfect second-hand transcription and a semantic distinction between no apology for the abduction and an apology for the death, are mundane, everyday explanations for exactly the kind of discrepancy that shows up constantly in fast-moving news coverage of any complex case and require no assumption of concealment at all. The third, that an entirely separate, unreleased note or draft might exist, is a genuinely more significant claim, and it's the one Enton was careful to frame as speculation rather than something he could confirm. We think that distinction matters. 2 boring, likely explanations sit right next to one more dramatic, unconfirmed one, and a responsible account of this discrepancy has to hold all 3 possibilities without collapsing toward whichever sounds most interesting. Enton also raised a pointed question about Savannah Guthrie's employer, NBC News, and the fact that the network's own earlier no apology reporting was never publicly corrected once the actual note surfaced with an apology in it. We want to address this directly, because we think it's the part of this specific analysis that needs the most careful handling. The suggestion embedded in raising it this way, that Savannah's silence on an uncorrected story from her own network somehow carries evidentiary weight, asks viewers to draw an inference the facts don't actually support. Savannah Guthrie is not a reporter covering this story. She's the victim's daughter, and federal investigators routinely instruct families in active kidnapping and homicide investigations not to publicly comment on specific evidentiary details, precisely because doing so can compromise the investigation or tip off whoever's responsible about what law enforcement actually knows. A family member's silence about a discrepancy in a competing outlet's sourcing is not unusual, is not suspicious on its own, and doesn't require any more sinister explanation than ordinary caution during an ongoing case involving her own mother. We think it's worth being explicit about why this specific rhetorical move, raising a fact and letting the audience draw the darker inference without ever quite stating it yourself, is worth naming when we see it, regardless of who's doing it or which case it's attached to. It's a structure we've flagged before on this channel in the Nolan Wells case, where a body language read on one sentence became a headline about someone being caught in a lie, or where a hedged forensic finding about discoloration became a claim of confirmed blunt force trauma. The mechanism is the same each time. State a real, verifiable fact, then arrange the surrounding language so the viewer supplies the more dramatic conclusion themselves, which lets the presenter technically avoid ever having made the claim outright. We'd rather name that pattern directly than simply repeat it under a different case's name. It's worth explaining what forensic psychological analysis of a written document, sometimes called forensic linguistics or statement analysis, actually claims to do and doesn't, because the discipline itself sits in a genuinely contested space within forensic science more broadly. Unlike DNA or fingerprint analysis, which rely on physical matching against known reference samples, this kind of analysis works by drawing on a professional's accumulated experience, reviewing genuine threatening and extortion communications across many prior cases, looking for patterns that tend to distinguish authentic, high-stakes communications from ones written by someone without direct personal involvement in the underlying crime. It's a real recognized investigative tool used by the FBI's own behavioral analysis unit, among others, but it produces professional judgment calls rather than the kind of statistically quantifiable certainty a DNA match can offer, and it should be weighed accordingly, useful, informed, and worth taking seriously, but not treated as though it carries the same evidentiary weight as physical forensic evidence. Now to the more substantive material in this coverage. The forensic psychological analysis of the notes themselves, from Dr. Chris Mohandie, a clinical police and forensic psychologist who's advised law enforcement agencies extensively in exactly this kind of case. His analysis is detailed, technical, and worth walking through point by point, because it's considerably more rigorous than most of the commentary this case has generated. Mohandie starts with a basic structural question. Why would someone holding a captive send their demand to a public television station rather than directly to the family? If you actually have Nancy Guthrie, he points out, you'd have far more direct and controllable ways to reach Savannah than broadcasting your demand to a news outlet, which invites exactly the kind of public scrutiny, media attention, and law enforcement coordination that makes safely collecting a ransom considerably harder. Genuine kidnappers seeking payment generally want the opposite. A private, controlled channel, not a public one, since every additional set of eyes on a demand is another chance for it to be intercepted, analyzed, or traced before money ever actually changes hands. He also flags the note's own language as a red flag, the kind of detail that's easy to skim past on a first read, but that stands out immediately to someone who's spent years comparing genuine threat communications against each other. The letter uses the word ransom explicitly, which Mohandie notes is unusual. People who are actually running a genuine ransom scheme, in his professional experience, tend not to name the crime they're committing in the middle of committing it. In the same way, you generally don't announce out loud that you're doing something you already know exactly what it's called. He also points to the specific mention of a Bitcoin payment in US dollar terms without specifying a time zone for the stated deadline. Despite the disappearance happening in Mountain Time, an inconsistency he says suggests either carelessness inconsistent with someone genuinely managing a live extortion attempt, or, more specifically, the possibility that some of the note's phrasing was generated with the help of AI tools rather than written entirely by someone personally and urgently managing the actual crime as it unfolds. A person truly holding a captive under time pressure, he suggests, tends to sweat exactly these kinds of operational details because getting them wrong risks the entire scheme collapsing over a missed deadline nobody can actually verify. The second note compounds his skepticism further and reads, by his own account, like a document written by someone reacting to how the first note had already landed publicly rather than someone executing a single, coherent plan from the outset. He points out the strangeness of a writer who explicitly states in the first note that this will be the last communication, then goes on to send a second one anyway, a shift he says is consistent with either multiple people involved, one of whom has a different agenda than originally stated, or a single author whose story simply isn't holding together across separate messages. He also highlights specific word choices in the second note, perished to describe a death, buried in nature, instead of any more direct description, as unusual phrasing that reads, in his words, more like something generated with AI assistance than the way an actual person under real stress typically writes about a death they caused or witnessed. Language, he says, feels workshopped and softened in a way genuine panic rarely produces. There's one more detail Mohandie raises that we think is genuinely interesting from a forensic linguistics standpoint. A specific spelling error that appears once but not twice within the same document. The word received is spelled correctly the first time it appears in the first note, and misspelled the second time, a small, easily overlooked inconsistency that becomes considerably more interesting once you're specifically looking for it. Mohandie reads this as evidence of a writer who is fundamentally literate and careful, someone bright enough to generally spell correctly, but inconsistent in a way that's harder to explain through simple carelessness alone. Another small data point feeding his broader theory that whoever wrote these notes is more educated, more technically comfortable, and more deliberate than the popular image of a spontaneous, panicked kidnapper improvising a ransom demand on the spot. Taken together, none of these individual details proves anything on their own. But Mohandie's cumulative case, built from tone, structure, specific word choices, and technical inconsistencies rather than any single smoking gun, is a genuinely different kind of skepticism than what we've seen from other commentators on this case, precisely because it's built from professional experience analyzing real extortion communications rather than from gut instinct about what sounds off. It's worth adding one more layer of technical context to the AI generation possibility Mohandie raised, because it's become a genuinely common consideration in current extortion and threat investigations generally, not something unique to speculation about this specific case. Large language models are, by design, extremely good at producing fluent, grammatically consistent, emotionally calibrated text on demand, including text designed to sound like a specific kind of communication, a ransom note, an apology, a threat. That capability cuts both ways for investigators. It means a genuinely inexperienced or opportunistic writer, someone with no real connection to Nancy's disappearance at all, could produce a document that reads as more polished and psychologically coherent than their own natural writing ability would otherwise allow, which is part of why Mohandie's skepticism about authenticity and his observations about the writer's apparent education level aren't necessarily in tension with each other. A less sophisticated person using AI assistance can produce text that reads, on the surface, as though it came from someone considerably more sophisticated than they actually are. Where Mohandie's analysis becomes most consequential is in what it implies about the underlying nature of the crime itself. He doesn't believe this began as a planned kidnapping for ransom at all. His working theory is that it started as a home invasion or burglary that went wrong, and that whatever ransom demands have surfaced since are, if genuine at all, an after-the-fact decision rather than the original motive. It's worth pausing on how significant a reframing that actually is for a case that's been publicly discussed, almost universally, under the label of kidnapping since the very first days of coverage. A kidnapping implies intent, planning, and a specific goal from the outset. A burglary or home invasion gone wrong implies something considerably messier. A crime that began with one objective and spiraled in real time into something its perpetrator may not have anticipated or wanted. A distinction that changes not just how the case should be labeled, but how investigators might need to think about the kind of person responsible, their likely prior criminal history, and their probable behavior in the months since. His reasoning is worth walking through carefully. An 84-year-old woman with documented medical needs, he points out, is an unusually high-maintenance person to actually kidnap and hold captive. Basic logistical planning, the kind any deliberate kidnapper would be expected to do in advance, would reveal that taking on a captive with significant medical requirements creates enormous ongoing logistical burden. Medication, monitoring, care, all of it happening while also evading law enforcement. That's a very different profile than the kind of victim someone planning a kidnapping for ransom scheme would typically select if profit were the actual pre-existing goal, since professional kidnappers who plan ahead of time generally gravitate toward victims whose captivity can be managed with the fewest possible complications, not the most. There's a comparative case worth mentioning here, because it illustrates exactly the distinction Mohandie is drawing. Kidnappings for ransom that actually succeed at extracting payment tend to share a common structural feature. The victim is generally someone whose captivity can be sustained relatively easily, often younger, healthier, and requiring minimal ongoing care, precisely because the entire scheme depends on the captor maintaining control over an extended negotiation period without the situation collapsing under its own logistical weight. An elderly captive with specific ongoing medical needs breaks that model almost immediately, which is part of why Mohandie's instinct runs toward an unplanned, reactive scenario, rather than a calculated criminal enterprise built around this specific person as a target for profit. Dr. Mohandie referenced one other comparison worth including because it grounds his skepticism about the notes in a concrete historical precedent rather than pure intuition. He pointed to the Unabomber case, noting that publicly releasing a suspect's own writing eventually helped investigators secure a critical break, when Ted Kaczynski's brother recognized the writing style in the Unabomber's published manifesto. That's part of why Mohandie said he still supports releasing the Guthrie notes publicly, even while remaining personally skeptical of their authenticity. The same tactic that worked in one of the most famous cold cases in FBI history doesn't require investigators to be confident the document is genuine before trying it, only that trying it carries little downside and a real, if modest, chance of producing exactly the kind of recognition that broke that earlier case open after decades of failure. When directly asked why, if this started as a burglary gone wrong, the perpetrator would take Nancy with them rather than simply fleeing the scene, Mohandie offered several evidence-based possibilities rather than a single confident answer. It's possible the person feared being identified either because Nancy had seen their face or because they'd left behind DNA or other trace evidence they were trying to control the exposure of. It's possible, and Mohandie was careful and somber in raising this, that if Nancy had already been seriously harmed during whatever went wrong inside that house, removing her from the scene was a way of delaying investigators from finding evidence of what had actually happened, buying time rather than solving a financial problem. None of these are confirmed. All of them are more consistent, in his professional view, with a chaotic, unplanned aftermath than with the calm, controlled logistics of an actual, premeditated kidnapping for ransom operation, and he was careful to describe even the darkest of these possibilities in measured, clinical language rather than sensationalized detail, a restraint we think is worth noting given how easily a theory like this could be presented for shock value instead. It's worth sitting, briefly, with how uncomfortable this specific line of reasoning actually is, because we don't think it should be walked past too quickly. Mohandie is essentially describing a scenario in which removing Nancy from her home may have been less about her specifically, and more about managing whatever evidence or exposure her presence there represented to whoever was responsible. That's a genuinely difficult thing to sit with for a family that spent 6.5 months holding on to hope for her safe return, and we want to be clear that Mohandie himself never claimed this was the confirmed scenario, only one of several evidence-consistent possibilities investigators have to keep on the table. We're including it here because we think an honest account of this case has to include the theories that are actually being discussed by people with relevant professional expertise, not just the ones that are easiest to sit with. We should be clear before going further about what kind of claim this actually is. Mohandie was explicit, more than once, that he doesn't hold a monopoly on the truth here, and that investigators should keep multiple working theories alive rather than fixating on any single one, including his own. That's a meaningfully more responsible posture than most of what circulates about this case online, and we think it's worth applying the same standard to his theory that we'd apply to anyone else's. It's a professional, experience-based assessment, not a confirmed finding, and it hasn't been endorsed or contradicted by Pima County investigators in any public statement we're aware of as of this recording. Mohandie also directly addressed a theory that circulated widely online and that a meaningful share of this case's amateur commentary has treated as a near certainty, that Nancy was specifically targeted because of her connection to her famous daughter, perhaps by someone fixated on Savannah personally. He pushed back on this fairly firmly, drawing on his own extensive background evaluating actual stalking cases involving public figures. In cases involving genuine stalking or fixation on a public figure, he explained, the person responsible is very often already known to investigators, someone who's shown a documented pattern of overcommunication, unwanted contact, or concerning behavior before ever escalating to something like this. The absence of any such person surfacing quickly in this investigation, in his professional experience, makes a stalker-driven motive less likely, not more, though he stopped short of ruling it out entirely. He offered a separate, related read on something that had drawn its own share of public scrutiny. Savannah Guthrie's own public video messages addressed directly to whoever might be holding her mother. Messages some viewers online read as unusually personal or intimate given the circumstances. Mohandie described that kind of direct humanizing appeal as standard, recommended practice in hostage and kidnapping negotiations generally, a deliberate attempt to make an abstract victim into a real person in the mind of whoever's responsible, precisely the opposite of a sign that something's off about the family's public conduct. We think that's a useful, level-headed corrective to a specific strand of online speculation that's read Savannah's own public grief and advocacy as somehow suspicious, when the behavior he's describing is exactly what trained crisis negotiators generally encourage families to do. It's a pattern worth naming on its own. Any genuine, visible emotion from a victim's family, whether it's a mother's tears at a press conference or a daughter's direct video appeal to a captor, risks being read by some corners of the internet as performance rather than authentic grief. Simply because true crime audiences have absorbed decades of tabloid coverage, teaching them to treat composure as suspicious, and emotion as suspicious in roughly equal measure. At some point, there's no way for a grieving family member to behave that some fraction of an audience won't read as evidence of something. We think that's worth naming plainly rather than participating in it. On the broader question of motive, Mohandie leaned toward a theory that's gotten less attention than either the Ransom framing or the Stalker framing, that Nancy was likely connected even indirectly to whoever's responsible rather than randomly selected. He was direct that pure random selection, someone picking her house simply because it looked appealing in the dark, doesn't fit well with what's known about the case, particularly reports that the person responsible had reportedly been seen scouting the property on camera days before the actual incident, a level of advanced reconnaissance that argues against pure spontaneity. His alternative isn't necessarily that Nancy personally knew her attacker, it's that information about her, her routine, her home, her family's resources, could plausibly have passed through an expanding circle of loose connections, a caregiver, a service worker, someone who heard something secondhand and mentioned it to the wrong person, without any of those original sources being involved in what ultimately happened themselves. This is precisely the kind of theory that's genuinely hard to investigate and even harder to cover responsibly because it implicates an entire diffuse network of ordinary people rather than a single identifiable suspect, and it means investigators are, in practice, working through concentric circles of loosely connected acquaintances rather than a short list of obvious persons of interest, a slower and considerably less satisfying process than the clean, single-suspect resolution most true crime coverage implicitly promises its audience. There's a practical, forward-looking piece of Mohandie's analysis worth including as well, because it speaks directly to why investigators keep a case like this publicly active for so long even without a breakthrough. He explained that in cases involving more than one person, it can take considerable time, sometimes years, for the specific social bonds holding a group together, fear, loyalty, a sense of shared risk, to weaken enough that someone feels safe coming forward, and that this dynamic doesn't move on any predictable schedule investigators can simply wait out with confidence. Publicity itself, he argued, plays a direct role in that process. Keeping a case in the news, reissuing appeals, releasing documents like the ransom notes even when investigators are privately skeptical of them, all of it is partly designed to unsettle whatever equilibrium currently exists among the people who know something, in the hope that renewed attention eventually shifts someone's calculation about whether staying silent is still worth it. That framing directly answers a question that's followed this case since the ransom notes were first released. Why put out documents investigators themselves aren't confident are genuine? Former FBI Special Agent Harry Trombitas offered a similar, more blunt version of the same explanation to Yahoo News. noting that when a case goes quiet and public attention starts to fade, investigators will sometimes release a piece of information specifically to generate renewed interest, a tactic he described from his own investigative experience across many prior cases rather than anything specific to this one. Both explanations point to the same underlying reality. The decision to release these notes publicly may have had as much to do with reviving public attention as with any specific confidence that the documents themselves are authentic evidence from the actual person responsible. That's a genuinely useful thing for viewers to understand about how missing person investigations actually function over long timelines, because it changes how you should read every subsequent update this case produces. Not every piece of information investigators release is being released because they've suddenly gained new confidence in it. Some of it is released precisely because confidence hasn't changed, and the goal is simply to keep enough public pressure and attention alive that the case doesn't quietly fade into the enormous backlog of unsolved disappearances that never make it past a single news cycle. Understanding that distinction doesn't make any individual update less worth covering. It does mean audiences, and channels like this one, should resist reading every release as a sign that a break in the case is imminent. We want to spend a moment on a separate, more recent development that's generated its own wave of anxious speculation, precisely because we think the appropriately cautious response to it matters. On August 17th, human remains were discovered in a desert area roughly 15 miles from Nancy's home, near West Ajo Way and South La Chola Boulevard in Tucson. The Pima County Sheriff's Department stated directly that there's no indication at this time that the remains are connected to Nancy's case, and that they appear to have been in that location for an extended period, consistent with simply predating her disappearance entirely, a detail investigators have not elaborated on further beyond confirming the basic timeline discrepancy. It's worth explaining why authorities were able to say that fairly quickly, and why this doesn't necessarily represent an unresolved cliffhanger the way isolated headlines about it might suggest. Even though the timing, so soon after a case has spent months without a break, is exactly the kind of coincidence that tends to spike anxious speculation regardless of what investigators actually find. Southern Arizona's desert terrain, precisely because of its remoteness and its position along major migration routes, is a location where human remains are discovered with some regularity, and not exclusively, or even primarily, in connection to any single active investigation. Remains connected to migrants who died attempting to cross remote desert terrain, and, less frequently, remains connected to indigenous history in the region, are both documented recurring categories of discovery in the same general area, entirely separate from any specific missing persons case, making national headlines at a given moment. That context doesn't mean investigators are right to rule out a connection this quickly in every case. It means that, in a region with this particular geography and history, a fresh discovery of unidentified remains isn't automatically evidence of anything related to whichever high-profile case happens to be dominating the news cycle at the time it's found. We think it's important to say that plainly because the alternative, treating every desert discovery near Tucson as a potential break in Nancy's case, would set an expectation that's almost certain to generate repeated, unnecessary anguish for her family every time unrelated remains surface in that same general region. Something that, unfortunately, is likely to keep happening, independent of whatever eventually happens with her case specifically. We'd rather explain that context clearly once than let every future desert discovery in southern Arizona become its own fresh cycle of speculation attached to a case it most likely has nothing to do with. We think it's worth stepping back, briefly, to consider what this specific case reveals about how missing persons investigations actually get covered once they stretch past the first few dramatic weeks. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had every ingredient that typically produces sustained national attention. A famous daughter with a national broadcast platform, a wealthy, affluent neighborhood, an elderly, sympathetic victim, and a genuinely disturbing home invasion with no immediate suspect. And yet, 6.5 months later, what actually exists in the public record is considerably thinner than the volume of coverage might suggest. 2 notes of uncertain authenticity, 1 wrongly detained delivery driver, 1 professional psychological theory built from careful but ultimately unconfirmed inference, and a federal government that's explicitly declined to take the lead. That gap between the sheer amount of attention a case generates and the actual amount of verified information available is not unique to this case. It's close to a structural feature of high-profile disappearances generally, and we think naming it plainly is more useful to viewers than pretending each new development represents more forward progress than it actually does. We have 2 ransom notes that investigators themselves have never confirmed are authentic, released publicly specifically to generate leads rather than as confirmed evidence. We have a genuinely interesting, professionally grounded psychological theory suggesting the underlying crime may have begun as something considerably less calculated than a planned kidnapping, an argument built from specific, defensible technical observations about the note's language and structure rather than vague intuition. We have a real, documented discrepancy in how the second note's contents were reported before its official release. An inconsistency worth understanding honestly, without being stretched into an insinuation about the victim's own family that the facts don't support. And we have a fresh discovery of human remains that, however unsettling to encounter in a headline, does not currently appear to have any connection to this specific case, in a region where such discoveries are sadly not uncommon for entirely unrelated reasons. Nancy Guthrie remains missing tonight. No suspect has been named, and no arrest has been made. The reward for information leading to her safe recovery or an arrest in the case remains active, funded by a combination of family resources and outside contributors. If you have any information, you're encouraged to contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI directly, whether or not it seems significant to you. Investigators and independent analysts who've studied cases like this one consistently say the smallest overheard detail is often exactly the piece that eventually unlocks a case like this. Nancy Guthrie's family continues waiting for that one piece to surface, 6.5 months and counting. We want to close on the same note we opened with, because it's the part of this episode we think matters most. A ransom note is, in the end, just words on a page or a screen, and words can be studied, questioned, and picked apart with real professional rigor without any of that analysis actually bringing a specific missing woman home. Dr. Mohandie's theory about a home invasion gone wrong is genuinely well-reasoned. It's also, right now, exactly as unconfirmed as every other theory this case has produced, including the ones that sound more comfortable. What hasn't changed in 6.5 months through ransom notes, wrongful detentions, federal jurisdiction disputes, and now an unrelated set of human remains found in the desert, is the actual simple fact this case has always come down to. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her own home in the middle of the night, and nobody outside whoever did it knows where she is. Everything else, every theory, every document, every statement from every official is either a step toward closing that gap or it's noise. We've tried in this episode to be honest about which is which. One last thing worth adding, since it applies to every source we've cited across this episode, from a working detectives union representative to a psychologist who spent decades inside real hostage negotiations. Every one of them was careful, in their own way, to mark the boundary between what they actually know and what they're inferring from experience. And we think that habit, more than any specific conclusion any of them reached, is the thing actually worth learning from this case. A missing person investigation this complex rarely rewards the loudest, most confident voice in the room. It tends to reward whoever's still asking careful questions 6.5 months in, long after most of the audience has moved on to the next headline. This has been Forensic Disconnect. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered, until they are.